Welcome, everyone. My name is Jenny Irons, and I'm a Senior Program Officer at the William T. Grant Foundation. Today, I'll provide an overview of our Institutional Challenge Grant Program and provide some insights into what we look for when we review applications and discuss the application process. Here's an overview of what we'll talk about today. First, I'll provide a brief background about the Foundation's funding interest to explain why we're particularly interested in this particular grant program. And then I'll spend some time talking about the Institutional Challenge Grant Program. At that point, we'll take some time for questions about the material I've covered thus far. And then in the second half of the webinar, we'll turn to an overview of the application and review process. We'll take some time for questions at the end of that as well. I do want to note that attendees can submit questions at any time via the GoToWebinar dashboard, and we'll answer as many as we can during our 2 Q&A periods. I'm joined today by our president, Adam Gamoran, and he's going to help me field questions during both the Q&A sessions. We'll share a recording and slides from the webinar on our website next week. Attendees will also receive an email about the same thing, and we'll share our new and updated application guidance at that time. The William T. Grant Foundation was founded in 1936 by William T. Grant, who was the owner of a chain of five and dime stores. We fund about $15 million per year across all of our grants programs. Since the beginning of its founding, the Foundation has worked to further understanding of human behavior through research. We do this by focusing on the most pressing challenges facing young people. Specifically, we support high-quality research that is relevant to improving outcomes for youth ages 5 to 25 in the United States. We have 2 main funding priorities. We invest our research dollars in studies to improve the use of research evidence that supports studies on strategies to improve the use of research evidence in policy and practice in ways that benefit youth. And our Reducing Inequality initiative supports studies about ways programs, policies, and practices can reduce inequality in outcomes among young people. The Institutional Challenge Grant Program merges our 2 funding interests. First, it does this by supporting research practice partnerships, and a mechanism through which research produced is more likely to be used and useful. Second, the research agenda that is co-developed in partnership is focused on reducing inequality in youth outcomes. The Institutional Challenge Grant Program was established in 2017, and the first grant was made in 2018. Since then, we have been very fortunate to partner with other funders, including the Spencer Foundation and the Doris Duke Foundation, to enable us to support additional grants. This year, the Bezos Family Foundation joined us to enable us to support 4 grants in total. And those will be announced shortly. We just learned last week that our board approved 4 new grants, which we are extremely excited about, but we can't announce those quite yet, so please look for an announcement about those grants in the next few weeks. The Institutional Challenge Grant asks grantees to pursue 4 goals. First, grow an institutional partnership with a public agency or nonprofit organization. The Research Practice Partnership will have defined objectives, roles, and agreements, and will be built for the long term. In this way, the partnership will be mutually beneficial, enabling the partners to develop and pursue a joint research agenda that is relevant to the public agency or nonprofit organization's work over an extended period of time. Second, pursue a joint research agenda to reduce inequality in youth outcomes. The partnership's research will aim to build, test, or increase understanding of programs, policies, or practices to reduce inequality in the academic, social, behavioral, or economic outcomes of young people. Third, create institutional change to value research practice partnerships within research institutions. The research institution will design a feasible strategy for institutional change that addresses observed structural, motivational, and financial barriers that inhibit research practice partnerships at the institution. By establishing structural supports and incentives that encourage skilled, mid-career researchers to conduct joint work with policymakers and practitioners, the institution will develop an environment for partnerships to thrive. Fourth, enhance the capacity of both partners to collaborate on producing and using research evidence. through new experiences that foster deeper understandings of a given policy or practice context and deepen relationships with partners, grantees on the research side will enhance their capacity for participating in effective partnerships. At the same time, the public agency or nonprofit organization will enhance their own capacity to partner with researchers, as well as understand, conduct, and use research through activities such as technical assistance, infrastructure improvements, or staff training. While this grant and its challenges are ambitious, we believe this is what is needed to produce and use relevant research in practical ways. I'll now take some time to walk through each of these 4 areas individually with a little more detail and examples from our current grantees. First, let's talk about research practice partnerships. The Foundation defines research practice partnerships as long-term, mutually beneficial collaborations that promote the production and use of rigorous and relevant research. In other words, research practice partnerships adopt a long-term view, persist beyond a single project, and involve relationships between institutions, not just 1 or 2 individuals, and they benefit both parties. Researchers who partner with practitioners or policymakers are better equipped to understand local context, address pressing issues, and produce informative and actionable findings. They also gain access to programmatic and/or policy insights and data that can facilitate rigorous and groundbreaking research to make headway on issues relevant to youth lives. Policymakers and practitioners, meanwhile, can more easily access, interpret, and use research evidence when they collaborate with researchers. They can also help define and shape research agendas. Partnerships then equip public agencies and nonprofit organizations with new knowledge and tools to better serve youth. Building sustained research practice partnerships requires significant investments. It takes time to develop the trusted relationships that form the foundation of the partnership. Establishing the infrastructure to grow and sustain a partnership requires considerable resources. And although we suspect that research practice partnerships are most robust when they are built at the institutional level, research produced by partnerships is not always valued by institutions. Research institutions' policies and practices can inadvertently create disincentives to participating in research practice partnerships. In turn, this can make it difficult to recruit experienced researchers to participate in these partnerships or to sustain their involvement beyond a single project. And I will say more about this later when I talk about the goal of institutional change. The second goal asks partnerships to pursue a joint research agenda to reduce inequality in youth outcomes. Why reducing inequality? The Foundation is interested in research on reducing inequality for a few reasons. First, inequality is by economic, racial, ethnic, and immigrant origins is pervasive in the United States. Second, we have a lot of social science evidence and other evidence on the nature and sources of that inequality. What we have a less clear idea about are ways to reduce those inequalities. We believe that social science can bring important evidence to bear on programs, policies, and practices that reduce inequality in youth outcomes. So let me talk a little bit about our interest in research on reducing inequality to help inform the way you're thinking about developing a shared research agenda between research institutions and public agencies or nonprofit organizations. For this grant, the partnership must conduct research to build, test, or increase understanding of programs, policies, or practices to reduce inequality for youth. The research questions must be relevant to the local organization while also informing theory and extending prior and current research. The proposed research agenda must first identify specific inequality in youth outcomes, and the Foundation, as you see on this slide, has specific interest in economic standing, race and ethnicity, immigrant origin, and language minority status. You have to also make a convincing case for the dimension of inequality the study will address, and articulate how findings from your research will help build, test, or increase understanding of a program, policy, or practice to reduce the specific inequality you have identified. The Foundation supports research from a range of disciplines that use a variety of methods. We welcome descriptive studies that clarify mechanisms for reducing inequality or elucidate how or why a specific program, policy, or practice operates to improve youth outcomes. We also welcome intervention studies that examine attempts to reduce inequality. We encourage applications that address inequalities across multiple youth-serving systems, such as education, the justice system, workforce development, housing, immigration, mental health, and child welfare. One thing I do want to flag for this year's competition is that one of our funding partners, the Doris Duke Foundation, has a particular interest in supporting partnerships engaged in research that focuses on outcomes related to preventing children and families from coming into contact with the child welfare system. So again, interested in receiving partnerships that are examining ways to reduce inequality across all youth serving systems. We have a special interest this year in research focusing on the child welfare system. Let me give you a few examples now of current grantees research studies. And I do want to know that in these partnerships, sometimes the partnership is focused on one study over the whole grant period. Other times they often have different studies they're pursuing to answer questions the public agency or nonprofit organization wants answered. So one thing I want to note is that in the Toronto example, this is one example of several studies the partnership is pursuing. So they do have several different research studies underway examining different strategies, policies to improve youth education in Puerto Rico. The Johns Hopkins example you see here and the University of Toronto example you may notice illustrate that partnerships can exist across geographic boundaries. So the University of Toronto is working with the Department of Education of Puerto Rico. The researcher at Johns Hopkins University is working with the Fort Belknap Indian community. So this is actually unusual for our portfolio. The 14 grants that we've currently funded, of the 16 grants we've currently funded, 14 are co-located in the same community with their community partner. In the final example you see, the University of California, Santa Cruz and the United Way of Santa Cruz are working together on a project that seeks to improve outcomes for youth in the local community, and it also involves first-generation Latinx college students to improve their own educational outcomes as well. Let me turn now to talking about the challenging goal of institutional change. Oops, excuse me. So some partnerships interested in applying may consider this the biggest challenge of all to tackle. So let me give you a little bit of insight into how we're thinking about this work and what our grantees are doing. While research practice partnerships can be rewarding and incredibly useful, they are also time-intensive and require supports from the institutions involved. The policies and practices within institutions, universities in particular, may create barriers to partnership success. For example, promotion criteria often value publishing in academic outlets, publishing often, and publishing on a narrow range of topics. These incentives may make it difficult to attract and retain public agencies or nonprofits as partners, and difficult to attract and retain experienced researchers who want to address questions that are relevant to policy and practice. It can also discourage members of the partnership from spending time cultivating the relationships and trust that are needed for the partnership to thrive and be sustained. In turn, these long-standing reward structures may limit participation between and within institutions, obstruct career advancement, and undermine the longevity of partnerships. The Institutional Challenge Grant is a direct response to these obstacles. It requires research institutions to examine and redesign internal policies and practices in ways that encourage sustained institutional partnerships with public agencies or nonprofit organizations, in ways that incentivize exceptional researchers to initiate and pursue rigorous and relevant research agendas, and in ways that improve partnership skills of researchers. In short, we hope the program catalyzes institutional change to better value research practice partnerships and their work. This is challenging, but we think it is a necessary step to build and sustain partnerships that produce and use relevant research in impactful ways. As with all components of the application, it is important to be clear about how your institution will address barriers. In the application, you will want to first describe the specific barriers to engage scholarship that exist at your institution and show how the proposed plan for institutional change addresses those particular barriers. You'll want to provide a compelling plan to alter or introduce policies, practices, or incentives to encourage strong researchers to conduct joint work with public agencies or nonprofit organizations. Initial strategies might include course releases, reductions in service obligations, seed money to support partnership work, forums that showcase the work, or other strategies that, again, address the barriers specific to your institution. You'll also want to engage deeply with the question of how your institution can do more to value the work of research practice partnerships and those engaged in partnering. Propose a plan that is bold, feasible, and specific to the barriers of your institution. Finally, show reviewers that the institution is committed to continuing these significant efforts beyond the award period. Let me give you now a few examples of institutional change that our current grantees have undertaken. We've seen our grantees propose the development of and support of university centers that are focused on raising the quality and visibility of community-based research, and to serve as a source to connect community-based agencies to researchers. We've seen universities tackle revisions to merit, tenure, and promotion criteria, as well as the IRB process, things that you may know can be barriers at universities to engage research with community partners. We've seen focused hiring efforts. We've seen the creation of new university-wide positions to support institutional change. So really, this is a way for partnerships to think about creative and bold ways to incentivize community-engaged research for the long term at your university. And we're proud to say that we funded 16 partnerships and institutions, researching institutions that are now engaged in this important work. Let's turn now to talking about the goal of developing the capacity of both partners to collaborate on producing and using research evidence. Research we have supported on the use of research evidence at the William T. Grant Foundation shows that one of the barriers to using research to inform policy and practice at public agencies and nonprofit organizations is a lack of capacity to do so. Capacity in terms of time, resources, and/or skills. Conversely, university researchers are not typically trained to be good partners, and they don't often have the time or skills to engage in productive co-developed research for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier. Thus, the final goal of this grant is to enhance the capacity of both the university partner and the community partner to collaborate on producing and using research evidence. Among our current grantees, some of the capacity building activities include building skills within the community partner organization to understand, engage in, and advance research, building skills within the research partners to write policy briefs and give joint presentations with community partners, strengthening data systems to collect useful ways to collect data on problems of practice, and collaboration on tools to support integration of research and data. Some partnerships have also embedded research positions within their community partners to support the use of research evidence and to help researchers be better responsive to the needs of community agencies. One of the components of this grant that is directly related to enhancing the capacity of both the university partner and the community partner to use research evidence is the mid-career fellow. The capacity building work of these partnerships is often largely carried out by the mid-career fellows, which again is a required component of the grant. Mid-career is defined as 8 to 20 years since the completion of a doctoral degree or residency for the university fellow, and 8 to 20 years of cumulative experience in a current role for the policy or practice fellow. Fellows are established in their careers with significant expertise and clear contributions to the project. Mid-career fellows need requisite skills to carry out the proposed work, and this includes not only conducting the research, but also building the partnership and capacity building within the community partner. The plan for the research fellows presented in the grant must significantly extend their skills to be effective partners. And so what this means is that for the mid-career fellows who are coming to this work with expertise in the research they carry out, perhaps they've already conducted partnership work, perhaps they've been engaged with school districts, for example, in carrying out discrete research studies. In your application, you really want to make clear how the partnership and the work of this grant is going to enhance the capacity of the university-based fellows to engage in partnership work. If you choose to also include policy or practice fellows in the work, you'll also want to explain what their background is, as well as how the grant will support their capacity to use research in the work that they do as a public agency or nonprofit organization. Among our current grantees, some of the examples of selection criteria for fellows include selecting fellows from existing faculty who are based at a university who have the motivation and skills to do partnership work. Perhaps you select a fellow who has prior experience doing bridge spanning work between research and government. You might also select one faculty fellow and one fellow from the partner organization to work together to advance research and goals of the grant. One of the things that we include in our application guidance is this graphic, which is meant to help you think about how to construct this part of your grant. We often receive questions about this particular aspect of the grant. Applicants want to know how to allocate the time of the mid-career fellows over the 3-year grant. So keep in mind that the grant itself provides funding for 2 FTEs for mid-career fellows, and the university needs to commit to making a match to funding a full-time equivalent fellowship as well. What this figure does is provide 3 different ways that you might allocate those monies, but you can certainly come up with different strategies. Our grantees use strategies different from this. It really is about thinking about what formulation makes the most sense for the work that you're proposing. So you can look at this figure in our application guidance. The different colors represent different individuals, but what this shows you is you can allocate the funding across years. Within years, you can fund fellows within the university. You can also fund fellows at practice organization. And again, our grantees have used different structures to do this. I want to pause now that I've covered a lot of information and take any questions you have about the program itself. And as a reminder, we'll turn to the application process after this brief Q&A period. Adam, any questions coming in yet?
Yes, Jenny, and hello, everybody. So pleased to see your questions. I'm going to take one of the last questions first because I think it's such an important one. One listener writes, "This is a tough ask. This institutional change idea is a tough ask because we as faculty do not have the power to make institutional change in our university." And I think this listener has grasped exactly the point of this challenge grant. It is a challenge, and it requires a coalition of faculty working together with university leadership to make the kind of institutional change that will prioritize partnership-oriented, engaged scholarship, scholarship directed at serving the public good as its first priority. Not all universities are ready for this, but you'd be surprised when I talk with university leaders around the country, person after person, institution after institution, whether it's a public or a private institution, is advocating for this, at least in their rhetoric. And we need faculty to work with university leadership to make this a reality. Okay, here are some other questions for you, Jenny. One listener has a question about the fellows, whether they come from the institutions or the partner agency. And could you talk a little bit about how some of our grantees are identifying their mid-career fellows, and specifically when they come from the university or are brought to the university for the purpose of serving as a mid-career fellow?
Sure. So one thing I do want to note is at the time of application, you may not necessarily have identified your mid-career fellow, but you do need to provide your selection criteria for how you will identify a mid-career fellow. So some successful applicants know who at least one of their mid-career fellows will be at the time of application. Other times they do not. Sometimes the mid-career fellow is located within a research institution, and sometimes they work with a mid-career fellow at a different research institution because they want to draw on that specific person's expertise. So let me give you a couple of examples of mid-career fellows at different institutions. So one of the examples of research that I shared earlier in the webinar was the University of Toronto. That's an example where they have used a different mid-career fellow almost every year, usually at the University of Toronto, but not always, to focus on those discrete research projects that they're carrying out in response to needs of the Puerto Rico Department of Education. This particular partnership also has a mid-career fellow located within the Puerto Rico Department of Education who is being responsive to the Department of Education there, their needs, communicating with research, but also supporting that partner in using research within the agency. Other partners are using faculty based at institutions to carry out the work of the grant. So for example, the grant to Northwestern University, one of the mid-career fellows, Simone Estelanda, is primarily responsible for carrying out and answering research for one of the questions posed by their local community partners. So the configuration really can vary. Again, you may know who you want the fellow to be at the time of the grant, and other times that's something you may need to work out during the planning period.
Thanks, Jenny.
Sure.
Is it possible to propose a partnership with more than one community partner?
Yeah, that is possible. And in several of the cases we have, current grantees are partnered with multiple community partners. I'll say a little bit about that first, and then I'm going to make another point about the application review process later. So one of our current grantees has two different partners. Actually, this is the grant to Northwestern University, and Adam, you may have to refresh my memory about some of the details if I miss them, but they're working with different age groups, so it requires working with two different community partners in the public school system. So that's a case where there are different community partners. I'm pausing because I don't want to give away too much about some of our new grantees, but one of our new grantees has actually 4 partners, so they're working with a local district attorney and 3 community organizations. And in that case, there really is a tremendous collaboration across these partners to address a local community need. What happens though is you can collaborate with multiple partners in submission of your application. But if your application advances through the review process, I'll say something about this in a minute, then you may advance to the stage where you're a finalist for the award and you come in for an in-person interview with our selection committee at our office in New York. And at that stage, there needs to be a clear lead partner organization who participates with the university partner in that interview. And for purposes of the application, there generally is a clear co-PI lead as well from the community partner organizations. But certainly, the problems facing youth are complex and may require working across different community partners, different youth serving systems, and we certainly welcome university researchers and community partners in thinking in creative ways about how to address complex problems youth are facing, and we certainly encourage collaboration.
Thanks, Jenny. Here's a question that I'd like to tackle because it's one I've often asked. What is the right level of maturity or years for a partnership to be applying for this grant? And what I can tell you is there are some partnerships that are so mature, are so long established, and have so many resources from so many quarters that the selection committee looks at the application and says, what is the value added of this grant for that partnership? On the other hand, there are partnerships that are brand new that have just started to meet, and the selection committee looks at that application and says, is there really something here? How much confidence do we have that this is really a going concern? So somewhere in between those extremes, not so well established that the ICG seems redundant to what they already have, and yet not so novel that they can't demonstrate in the application the kind of stability and joint collaboration that would give confidence that this grant is really going to succeed. So somewhere in between there. The person who asked this question also asked about focusing on research utilization and agency change, given that the partnership is already mature. And what I would say is, certainly focusing on research utilization agency change is exactly what we mean by building the capacity of the community organization to use evidence in its decision making. That's one of the 4 goals of the ICG, but it doesn't take the place of developing and pursuing a joint research agenda on reducing inequality in youth outcomes, nor of institutional change in the university. Um, Jenny, um, here's another question that I'd like to pass on to you. Is there a limit in the number of requests that can come in from one institution?
No.
Right. So the University of
Right.
X can propose multiple institutions,
Yes.
multiple awards, unlike some of our other grant programs, specifically the William T. Grant Scholars Program, which does have a limit of each major division of a university may only nominate 1 candidate per year. Um, we do not have a limit in the institutional challenge grant competition. I will say that no institution has ever won 2 institutional challenge grants, let alone 2 in the same year. If one university submits more than 1 grant, you're essentially competing against one another. But it is a competition in which each application is evaluated on its own merits. There's no consideration for whether there's an application from more than one place. And we have had, certainly have had, in fact, we had one year where one institution had 2 of the 5 finalists in the competition. So there's no limit. Okay, I think we'll take maybe one more question, and then we'll get to part 2 of the webinar, and then we'll return, and we'll continue to answer as many of the questions online as we can, and questions that we don't get to, we'll try to incorporate into a frequently asked questions subsequently. But one more questions for now, which is, do the fellows have to work with the same project, or could they undertake multiple projects with the same agency over the time period?
They could absolutely undertake multiple projects with the same agency over the time period. I mean, it really is thinking about being responsive to the agency needs and the questions they want answered. So at the time of application, you come in with a proposed research agenda, and for the most part, grantees are carrying out that work. But in being responsive to agency needs, you may find that adjusting over time, but certainly the same fellow can be with a project the entire time working on different questions.
Thanks, Jenny.
Right.
Let's get to part 2 of the webinar, and we do have another question period at the end. And in the meantime, our staff will try to answer as many of the questions that have come in online as possible.
Great, thanks, Adam. So let's turn now to the application process. The Institutional Challenge Grant provides $650,000 for 3 years with the possibility of a 2-year funded renewal to solidify the partnership in institutional change. So it can be a grant of up to $1 million over the course of 4 years, but there is a reapplication process for continuation funding after the initial 3-year grant. The monies within the grant map closely to the goals of the program. Applicants can allot up to 9 months and $60,000 to support joint planning to refine activities such as how you will select fellows and to finalize partnership agreements. There are also funds for the partnership to conduct research to reduce inequality in youth outcomes. And as stated earlier, the award includes funding for the equivalent of 1 full-time mid-career fellow per year for 2 years, with the university expected to make a match for an additional mid-career fellow. It can support resources to support activities that develop both partners' capacity to use research. And there's also an indirect cost allowance of up to 15% of the total direct cost. All of these costs and the indirect allowance are included in the $650,000 total. All right, let me continue. Applications are due this year on September 13th at 3 p.m. And one thing I do want to note is that our application guidance for this year is being finalized and will be released next week. It's not going to change that much, if at all, really, from last year, but every year we revisit our application guidance to see where we might make different aspects of the guidance clearer. So you will see that released next week, but if you're interested in getting a peek of what it might look like, then you can certainly look at the application guidance for the past year. The full proposal is submitted at the time of application, and it includes all agreements and statements of support. So it's a good idea to start early in preparing this application, which is one of the reasons why we held this webinar earlier in the year than we normally do. We have noticed each year that there are a number of applications that are started and not completed each application cycle. We've actually followed up with some folks who have started applications and not submitted them to ask why. And the number one reason they share is because they ran out of time or because it was difficult to collaborate with all the partners involved in the work to submit on time. So as I've reviewed today, the application has multiple components that require input and collaboration from the university partner and community partners, and with multiple levels within the university and perhaps within the community partner. This takes time, so I can't say it enough. Please make sure you're giving your partnership enough time to truly collaborate. You're giving yourself enough time to engage with university leadership so that they can understand the work of the grant and write a really strong letter of support for your application. This slide also reviews decision points in our review process, which is something that's really important for all applicants to know about. So first, once the applications are submitted, staff review the 4-page structured abstract that you submit with your application. So again, the application guidance is going to contain information about this. In short, the 4-page structured abstract is a condensed version of how the proposed work meets the 4 goals of the grant. The abstract is a really critical component of the application, and at this stage in the process, other materials are only reviewed as needed. Applications that fit with the Foundation's interests and selection criteria and that have been responsive to the call for proposals are then moved on to our selection committee for further review. Second, each proposal that is moved forward and is assigned to 2 members of our selection committee who then conduct in-depth reviews of the entire proposal. Applicants whose proposals receive favorable review at this stage are then moved forward to a second round of review. So at this stage, after review by selection committee, proposals that have the highest ratings are then discussed by the entire selection committee meeting at a meeting in early December. These deliberations rely heavily on those structured abstracts because it's not possible for all of the selection committee members to read all of the applications. So they read the structured abstracts, and then the 2 selection committee members who have reviewed your full proposal and reviewed it favorably are ones who provide really key details and understanding of the proposal during this meeting. So at the third stage, after the selection committee member reviews the proposals, they then select finalist partnerships. So we ask these finalist partnerships to respond to concerns raised during the review process in a letter and to also attend in-person interviews that I mentioned earlier. The application guidance contains dates so that applicants know when these in-person interviews take place in advance, and in 2024, we'll meet on February 2nd for these in-person interviews. In the past few years, we've selected 3 to 5 finalists for these in-person interviews. This usually depends on how many funding partners we have. Again, we've been fortunate in the past few years to have at least 2 funding partners in addition to the William T. Grant Foundation. This year, we had 3 additional funding partners. So it was unusual, and we were able to bring in 7 finalists, from which 4 grantees were selected. Finalists, again, come into that in-person interview having prepared a written response to concerns raised. And at that interview, selection committee members can ask questions about the proposal. They ask questions about the response. They ask questions to the applicants based on statements the applicants make to open up that in-person interview. Every year, we are committed to making at least 1 award for 1 partnership. Of course, we hope we continue to have good funding partners that enable us to make multiple awards per year. At the end of the 5 years, here is what the Foundation expects for our grantees in the Institutional Challenge Grant Program. We hope that the research institution will have established a set of strategies that facilitate sustained research collaborations with public agencies or nonprofit organizations. We also hope that the public agency or nonprofit organization has increased its capacity to use research evidence. Our hope is that participating researchers have improved their partnership skills and that the research generated has been used in decision making and is likely to lead to improved outcomes for youth. We know that the application is demanding, and we have developed resources to assist applicants with this process. As I mentioned, next week, the application guidance will be released for this year's competition. I encourage you to read this application guidance very closely. We have other resources on our website that are intended to help you as well. Next week, all of the attendees will receive a link to the slides for this webinar and a recording of the webinar. I also encourage you to review our website for previous webinars we've held, one in particular on institutional change and the other on mid-career fellows. We have readings on research practice partnerships and research on reducing inequality that can be helpful across different areas of our website. One thing I want to draw your attention to is that we have what we call a microsite, which provides a great deal of information about research practice partnerships. You can link to it when you receive the slides for this webinar. As you can see, it's linked here. You can also find it on our website. If you scroll down to the very bottom of the page on the right-hand side, there's a link to our RPP site, and I encourage you to check that out. We've also asked current grantees to write blog posts about their experiences engaging in partnership work and conducting institutional change, and those are listed on our website as well. Another thing we'll do for next week is that when you receive the application guidance, we'll also prepare a one-page link to really valuable resources on our website to help you sift through all of the important resources that are there. Some are really critical for thinking about as you prepare your application. I want to conclude with one tip as the slide is up on the page. I do want to note that in our application process, all 4 goals for the Institutional Challenge Grant Program that I started this webinar with are equally weighted in the review process, and the proposal should clearly develop and specify each goal. I encourage you to have colleagues who perhaps are not involved in the project to read your application. Is the research clearly specified? Are the institutional barriers and proposed incentives clear and convincing? And finally, does your proposal reflect collaboration and partnership? These are just some things you might think about as you prepare your application. A few things I want to mention as noteworthy, this is something that we are considered about across all of our application programs, but I do want to draw your attention to. The William T. Grant Foundation encourages proposals from teams with Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and Asian American members in leadership roles. We also welcome multidisciplinary and mixed method studies, which we think are often appropriate approaches to answer complex questions about reducing inequality for youth. And finally, resubmissions are welcome. I actually thought that this was a question Adam was going to ask earlier, but certainly if you were unsuccessful one year and you want to reapply again, we encourage that. We encourage you to take feedback you've received from the application process to strengthen your proposal and come back to us again to engage in what we think is really important and valuable work. This is a picture that was taken this year of our selection committee members who were in attendance for one of our in-person meetings. Our selection committee is dedicated to the promise of the Institutional Challenge Grant and committed to a thorough and careful review process. It includes individuals who have held a variety of professional roles, including university provosts, center directors, leaders of state and local agencies, funders, and researchers and practitioners who are actively engaged in partnerships. They also represent a diverse range of interests, including education, mental health, justice, and child welfare. They vary in their experiences working in and with public and private research institutions and are an accomplished and very supportive group of individuals. You can find the list of current selection committee members on our website. Again, this is a picture from last year of some of our committee members. It may be helpful for you also to learn more about the partnerships funded to date and descriptions of each partnership. Their proposed research and plans for proposed institutional change can be found on our website. Presented here are the 12 awards made during the first 6 rounds of competition. I look forward to adding the 4 new awards we're making this year shortly. You should note that the research partners include both public and private institutions, different colleges and departments within those institutions, including economics, public health, education, sociology, and human ecology. And they also represent different geographic regions across the United States and Canada with the University of Toronto. Likewise, the public and nonprofit partners include community organizations, school districts, and 2 regional agencies. We also welcome applications from partnerships with city and state agencies. I'm so pleased to announce that last week, as I said before, our board approved 4 new grants, which will be announced soon, including one in the justice space that I mentioned earlier that does involve a partnership between a university, 3 local nonprofits, and the district attorney's office. I do want to reiterate again, as I mentioned before, if someone joined us late, that of special note this year is the Doris Duke Foundation, one of our consistent funding partners in this program, is interested in supporting partnerships focused on preventing children and families from coming into contact with the child welfare system. So we encourage applications from partnerships working in this domain, as well as across other youth serving systems. Let me move now to our final slide. That was a short second half, but we're happy to take questions now about the application process or anything that I covered earlier in the webinar.
Thanks so much, Jenny. We've got lots and lots of questions coming in. About 10 people have asked whether the slides or recording will be available after this session.
They will be available next week, yes. And you will receive these, as I understand it, you'll get an email. All attendees of the webinar will get an email with a link to the recording and the slides. And they'll be posted on our website, as is true for all of the webinars we share.
Several people would like you to comment on the timeline for applications available, application deadline, and start dates for the award.
Thanks, Adam. The application guidance will be released next week. The portal will open May 18th, and that is, as of May 18th, you will be able to begin your application in our grants management system, our Smart Simple Grants Management System. The application deadline, I don't want to get this wrong, is September 13th of this year. Let me just make sure I'm telling you that correctly. I meant to say that to you earlier. Yes, September 13th will be the deadline this year at 3 p.m. And again, the portal will open May 18th. And the application guidance will be released next week, so hopefully that will give you a lot of time to dig into requirements of the application and to put your application together for submission on September 13th. So once you submit your application September 13th, that review process that I shared about earlier will kick into high gear. The selection committee makes decisions about grant applicants to recommend to our board in February. These grants are then approved at a board meeting, which takes place usually around the 3rd week of March. So the earliest start date for this proposed work would be April 1st. And generally start dates range anywhere from April 1st to early fall of, in this case, of 2004.
2024.
Yeah, my goodness. Thank you, Adam.
Okay, here's a question I'd like to take. And this is about, again, about the maturation and development of a research practice partnership. One of our applicants is writing about a research practice partnership that has struggled during the COVID period and wondering whether this grant would be a good resource to right the ship of the partnership. And I would answer that question by saying, can you make a convincing case in the application that this partnership will thrive, will be stable, will have the resources it needs to pursue, to jointly develop and pursue the research, and to pursue the kind of capacity building and institutional change that the grant application requires? If the answer to those questions is yes, then this grant could provide a tremendous resource to help a partnership reestablish its footing. If the answer is no, or if you're not sure, or if you think it would be hard to make the case in an application and to make the case in person if you're selected for the interview, then it might not be a good fit. Generally, the selection committee is looking for evidence that this partnership is a going concern, that relationships have been established. You have to submit a memorandum of understanding as part of the application. So, it's not for a brand new relationship. It's not for a relationship that's on the rocks, but it could be a resource, an important resource that could build on nascent relationships and turn it into a real ongoing partnership. By the same token, somebody has asked again about a 25-year-old research center. Can you apply? You may apply. The selection committee is going to want to know what is the value added of this grant to a research partnership that is already so well established. Jenny, an applicant would like to know whether funds for program services that will then be the target of the research are allowable in the budget.
So most, so the answer is possibly. And Adam, you may want to jump in on this one too, but most of the funds will need to support research and capacity building on behalf of both partnerships. So to the extent that the program activities you're talking about are related to the research, then that certainly might be possible. Adam, do you want to weigh in on that at all?
Yeah, generally the funds are for research, but to the degree, just as you said, Jenny, to the degree that there are kind of ancillary costs that need to be covered as part of the program services, that's generally allowable. But we would certainly be looking to, this is not a program grant. This is a research and partnership development grant. So I hope that answers your question. So one person would like to ask about the conditions or the dimensions of youth inequality. Is there a priority to focus on one dimension or to take an intersectional lens? How do we think about the dimensions of inequality and what might be the focus of the research for this project?
Yeah, that's a good question. So again, it really depends on being responsive to the partner's need, but certainly, I mean, you do not need to focus on one dimension of inequality. Many of our applicants focus on intersecting dimensions of inequality. So I'll just let you know that this year we're actually engaged in a stock taking of our grant making for this program thus far, and most of our grantees are looking at dimensions of inequality based on race, ethnicity, and economic standing. But we have partnerships that are also examining outcomes for LGBTQ youth, for youth who are unstably housed. We welcome applications from partnerships that are attending to immigrant youth. So again, you could focus on one dimension, you could focus on intersecting dimensions, you could make a compelling case for focusing on a dimension that is not listed as one of the foundation priorities. So we're open to a range of possibilities here. And again, it probably is really about being responsive to the organizational partner and the youth that they're serving.
Thanks. And could you comment about whether research with parents of youth ages 5 to 25 could be allowed in the research?
Sure. So I'll answer that question by talking about research grants we fund in general, that certainly sometimes the work is focused on parents or teachers, because based on the literature, you can make an argument that by focusing on parents or teachers, that is a way to improving youth outcomes. So as long as you can make the case based on extant literature that by focusing on parents or another group of adults is important for improving youth outcomes, we would be open to that.
Thanks, Jenny. We have about 5 minutes left, and I think we'll get in a few more questions. Here's one that I'd like to tackle. What are some ways you determine that the research institution has indeed changed in the ways expected? What are some of the acceptable metrics? Look, we are looking for universities to take on the challenge of incentivizing, supporting, and showing their value for partnership-oriented, engaged scholarship. So this can take on many forms. It can include resources devoted through mechanisms such as release time for faculty, or seed grants for faculty, or new leadership roles in the institution, such as an associate dean for partnerships. It can include changes to career advancement criteria. Now, there's a lot of attention given to changes to promotion and tenure, and certainly that's one realm in which institutional change is occurring in some universities to incorporate engaged scholarship as part of the tenure criteria. But that's not the only metric. First of all, we're looking at mid-career fellows. So what about the promotion to full professor and other signs of regard within the university? Some universities are offering prizes or special recognition for engaged scholarship. So, we're looking for mechanisms within the university that incentivize, that encourage faculty members, highly accomplished faculty members, to participate in scholarship that serves the public good. This is not to abandon the renowned basic research that many of our universities are supporting, but to say that alongside that, we can also engage in research that actually helps to improve youth outcomes. So that is the focus. That's what we mean by the focus of institutional change. Jenny, here's a question I'll send over to you. Let's say a particular school, like a school of public policy or a school of education or a school of nursing or a school of social work is applying for the grant. Is it sufficient to identify change within that school, or does change across the whole university have to occur?
Yeah, it's absolutely sufficient to identify change in that particular school, which is certainly what a number of our applicants have done by focusing on locating the change within, for example, a college of education, but really like where perhaps partnership work has been fairly discrete and conducted by discrete faculty members. The commitment is for the College of Education to really enhance and incentivize that work across the college in the kinds of ways that Adam just laid out.
Another questioner says, our university supports many kinds of community engaged research and values partnership-oriented research. We wish to focus more on community research and collaboration. Does that reduce our chances for funding? And I would say, no, it doesn't reduce your chance for funding. In fact, it might hold you up as an exemplar of the kind of scholarship that this grant is intended to support. You will, however, as I have commented on answers to several questions, you will have to explain what is the value added of this grant, given that you are already a paragon of community engaged research. Jenny, we're almost out of time. I'm going to throw one more question your way, and then we will wrap up. When we talk about the community organizations that partner with universities, we often talk about local organizations, but are we open to funding national organizations with multiple local sites?
Yes, we would absolutely be open to that. And again, you would just want to make the case about how the partnership will enhance the capacity of that national organization to use research and to improve youth outcomes.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid we have come to the end of our appointed hour. We've answered as many of the questions as we could. The slides and recording from this session will be available very soon. Jenny Irons, thank you so much for your presentation today, and thank you very much to everyone who has joined us. Please send us your applications. We look forward to reading them.
Thank you.